By the way, is that it's an extraordinary thing? Is this the Summer Palace?
Yes, it is the newly
Yes.
built. After they burned down the old summer
Uh,
palace, and
uh,
Cixi, she built the new one. The money's supposed to go to the Navy, the Chinese
that's right.
Navy.
That's right.
Yeah, she she put she put in her own summer palace. But the good thing about that is we get to see a summer palace, right? The
That's
royal
right.
summer the royal summer palace.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes.
So
How
yeah,
how do you how do you pronounce her name?
her
Because it's
name
very
is
different.
Cixi. Cixi. Yeah. Yeah.
Circe. Yes,
Yeah.
and I was told that it means the Empress of the West because she sat on the western part of of the palace. Is that what it
Her
means, Circe?
her Cixi is her name,
It's
or
her name,
I guess her official name.
official name.
But
Yeah.
the reason she's also being called the West, the palace, because after her
Mm,
son died, I mean, after her
mm,
husband died,
mm,
the emperor died. So she and the time the queen, she wasn't the queen or the empress, the
no.
official empress, but she's the mother of the new emperor. So the two
Mm,
of them was the one behind that emperor, the new emperor, who was very young, and one
right.
is living in the East Palace, and she's living in the
Uh,
West Palace.
oh,
So
I
that
see.
was,
Gosh, okay.
yeah,
That
that
was
was the
that was,
reason.
that was the reason.
Yeah.
Gosh, gosh. And I remember you telling me that your grandmother was born when she was still alive. When
Uh-huh.
the
Yeah.
I mean, astonishing to think that within the generation of one person, the life
Mhm.
of one person,
Yeah.
China has changed so
So
much.
much. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, my grandmother had a remarkable life. Just the simple fact that
yeah,
she was born
yeah.
1899 and that she died in
1999.
2000. So she
Yeah.
crossed the three
Mm,
millenniums, right? So
mm,
yeah,
mm.
that was a very turbulent time. A lot of things happened in China. So yes, it's
Absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely.
Okay.
Okay, I'm
Talking
ready.
talking about turbulence. And so Taiwan had an election. I have to say, I'm not convinced that this guy is, you can call it a democratically elected, considering there's only 70% of the voter voted. And out of that
Yeah,
70%, he got 40% of the vote. So eventually, we can say 28% of people who are eligible to vote supported him. But
yeah.
the West would call him democratically elected.
Mm,
But in his speech, it's unusually, I would say, unfriendly. I would say provocative,
mm,
because not only he's saying the name, okay, the Republic of China, which is the official constitutional name of Taiwan. He's saying that, yeah, we, the Republic of China, Taiwan, or Taiwan. He's essentially saying you can call yourself all
mm,
these, which is unconstitutional, and
mm,
certainly China, the mainland China, doesn't accept that. Not only he said that, he also said that the two sides, the mainland and the Taiwan, does not have any affiliation, which is clear declaration of independence, in my
mm,
view, right? That's
mm.
how, I mean, how do you interpret that? So
I
he's very,
complete.
go ahead.
Go on. No, no, go on. Well, just to say, I completely agree. I think that the secessionist movement in Taiwan is becoming more provocative all the time. I completely agree also that there's no reason to think that this election is any more secure than other elections in American vassal states tend to be nowadays. I
Yeah.
say that because it's absolutely clear that the United States is working now undoubtedly towards the secession of Taiwan. And they will want in Taiwan, let's call it Taiwan. They will
Hmm.
want in Taiwan somebody who will move forward with that secession process. I mean, I think that is absolutely clear. This is what this election was all about. And I ought to have sent it to you, but I only read it just before we did this program. A terrifying article in the Daily Mail, which is one of our newspapers here in Britain, which spoke with incredibly approving way about how US Marines are now training on Philippine islands,
Hmm.
including one which is within sight of Taiwan. And it was straightforwardly said in this article that they're training for war with China and war with China when Taiwan achieves, as they put it, achieves independence from China. So I mean, I think that this is madness on extraordinary scale, but clearly this is the agenda. And clearly this is the rhetoric this person is engaging in. What I suspect with the election, by the way, is that you probably find that there were all kinds of votes probably cast against him, which simply
Mm-hmm.
weren't counted or were lost,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
That's the
Yes.
way these
Yeah.
things are done. Because
Yeah.
at a time of such crisis, I find it difficult, actually. I mean, I appreciate 70% turnout in the West would
Mm-hmm.
seem high, but
Mm-hmm.
I would have thought that in a place like Taiwan, you would expect a much higher turnout than this. So I suspect that methods have been found to make sure that the people who would have voted against this man weren't able, their votes weren't counted. It's as
Yeah.
simple as that.
Yeah, definitively. And the way they counted, etc. Yeah, they're the same same tactic you've seen in
Yeah.
other places to
Mm.
secure. Yes. But actually, that's my question because clearly his speech is either get the U.S. approval or U.S. probably participated in crafting that speech, right? So you're thinking that you believe that U.S. do want him, Taiwan, to be more to going forward with this independence things to provoke China to have a real war? Is that where, because there's another possibility is that the US is very angry seeing Xi Jinping's visit to Europe and then of course Putin's visit
Mm.
to Beijing, and the way that the US revenge for this whole thing is to throw a tantrum just to make China feel bad. So let him say some hawkish thing, not necessarily means that they're going to seriously do something. But you think there's more into it, more to that than
I
just
think there is.
surface.
I
Okay.
think there is. I think, unfortunately, that there is. I mean, I think that there is an element of tantrum and anger in the US about this. But the underlying problem, the reason we are in this crisis is because of this terror the United States has that it's about to lose its hegemony. Now, why it is so important for the United States to retain its hegemony is another question. I mean, we've discussed this already. I mean, this hegemony is doing nothing for the American people. It's simply leading them into a disaster and a potentially disastrous war with China, which is something which is an insane thing to do.
Mhm.
But I'm now reading more and more articles. I suspect, by the way, that the British media is even more outspoken about this than the American in some ways. But
Mhm.
I see more and more articles which are clearly leading us in that direction. There was an article by a man called Eldridge Colby in the Financial Times. Now, he is the son, as it turns out, of a former director of the CIA, a fact I wasn't aware of. And he is absolutely part of the foreign policy establishment in the United States. And he was in charge of framing the US's 2018 national defense policy. So, they're talking a very, very important person. When you read that article in the Financial Times, what he's on the one hand telling to the Europeans is, look, you've got to, we can't be strong everywhere. We can't be strong in Europe. You've got to look after your own defenses. Russia is your problem. It isn't really our problem. And then, calamitously, he goes on to say, China is our problem. That is the adversary we must line up against. China is the biggest economy in the world, except for our own. Actually, it's probably bigger, but anyway, the Americans won't want to admit that. Asia is the more economically important region, more important now than Europe is. So America's priority is to prepare for a war with China. And that's, it's set out very clearly there. Now, of course, the Americans are always careful, but this is a very thin pretense to make it appear that this is going to be, they want to make it look like it's a war of aggression on China's part against Taiwan, the democracy in Taiwan, which the United States is going to come to the rescue of. But of course, the reality is, and it's exactly the same playbook I remember in Ukraine, provocation upon provocation leading to this conflict. And in Ukraine, we saw an endless succession of broken promises, a failure to resolve agreements to resolve the civil war in that country, preparations for an armed attack on the regions in the eastern Ukraine that were seeking at one time autonomy from the Ukrainian government. Events that eventually left the Russians feeling that they had no option but to intervene militarily. And we see the same process with Taiwan. Provocation after provocation directed towards China, an attempt to prepare the West and the American people for the view that China is the aggressor in this conflict, an aggressor with respect to its own territory. I mean, just remember this: Taiwan is recognized as a part of China. Just saying. Yeah. But anyway, endless attempts to do that. And I think that the United States is preparing the ground for a conflict with China, which it is intending to provoke. And I have to say that, to me, this isn't just irrational. It is outright mad. But that is what they're doing, and that's how they're acting.
It's very good you bring this up. I read that article too. This Albridge Colby, right? I think his father's name is William Colby. That's the CIA director. Yeah.
That's right.
But I actually read something about him because I'm curious. They characterized it, Politico had an article about him not that long ago. They actually characterized him and the people like him as realist. Mm-hmm. What is the realist about that? I don't understand that. The whole thing about realist is that he wants the U.S. to redirect their resource go to China, rather than tied up in Ukraine. Not only that, the article he didn't say, okay, let's just stop all the war in Ukraine. He's saying, Europe, you can continue to fight, right? We, the United States, we need to focus on China. Yeah. Isn't there a name for it? It's called the World War III. Isn't that what he's saying here?
Well, there's nothing realistic about this. This isn't realism. This is redefining the concept of realism in a way that it makes it the opposite of what it actually is. The only part of his article where there is a glimmer of connection to reality is when he says that the United States cannot be strong everywhere. So the United States doesn't have the resources to take on China and Russia at one and the same time. That's what he's saying. And he's saying, as you correctly said to the Europeans, look, no, you're not that important anymore. Let's face it. You've got to face on the Russians themselves. We've got to deal with the Chinese. That is the greater challenge for us. Now, that in Washington passes for realism, saying that, that our resources are not infinite. In every other respect, is mad. I mean, it's not realism in the way that, say, someone like Professor John Mearsheimer would define realism. Professor Mearsheimer and people like him say, look, you conduct your foreign policy. You seek to protect always your core national interests. Obviously, you do. And you look at what your resources are, and you aim above all to maintain peace. Because without peace, I mean, there is nothing. But that isn't what Mr. Colby and people like him are about. I mean, he's in no sense a realist at all. What was fascinating, by the way, about that article is to see the response from the various people who penned comments to it in the thread in the Financial Times. And they're all Europeans, and they're all furious. And they said, how dare you put China as the greater enemy than Russia? We must be equally aggressive towards both of them at the same time. So I mean, this is the type of debate that is conducted in the West. It is between two mad people. One group, one person is totally mad and completely disconnected from the reality. The other, in a way, is equally mad, but just this little glimmer of reality about one or two things. And that's enough to get him called a realist.
But if we do follow what he's saying is, okay, you, the Europeans, you can continue the war in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. We will start a war here with China. Isn't that World War III? I mean, that's basically what it is.
It's absolutely, well, I mean, I should say, by the way, it's unrealistic at two levels. Firstly, it is unrealistic at the great level because what he's talking about is we should aim for World War III with China, which is what it would be. I mean, it would be a, by the way, a war of a kind that the United States is psychologically completely unprepared for. They have been prepared for a war with the Soviets since the 1940s, but it would have been a ground war far away from American territory with all the seas in between. This would be a naval war. And that is very different. And conceptually, the United States has no understanding of that because it's had this maritime dominance until very recently. And it's never imagined that it would be facing up against a naval power equal to itself. And by the way, with a naval tradition far older than itself. Just saying. So it, you know, but you know, that is one. That's the grand unrealism of this. The other part, by the equation, that the Europeans can take care of Russia all by themselves and win the war in Ukraine by themselves, actually is also unrealistic. The reality is that the Europeans are completely unable to take on the Russians, either each country individually or all of them working collectively. I think that's been demonstrated conclusively now. And they certainly can't win the war in Ukraine for it without the help of the United States. Even with the help of the United States, they're losing the war. But without the United States, it's absolute game over, as everybody knows.
Yeah, and then if the Europeans are left alone, I mean, they probably won't accept. It seems like they won't accept that the total defeat by Russia by the Uranian. But but that will lead them to do something extreme, isn't it? That's something also is a possibility that they will probably strike inside Russia. I mean, there's some talking about that already, and talking about nuclear arm going to Poland and stuff like that. It's just very dangerous to me, like what they're talking about.
It is insanely dangerous, and I use both words carefully because it's dangerous, but it is also insane because what the United States ought to be doing, if it really wanted to do what Mr. Colby says it should do, which is withdraw from Europe and focus on China instead. It should be settling the conflict with Russia. It should be picking up the phone to the Russians and saying, "Look, we can't continue. We understand that you're going to win the war. It's going to be very embarrassing and difficult for us. But at the same time, if you win the war, you're going to have problems of your own. So let's sit down and come to some kind of agreement and see how we can limit the damage and come to an understanding with each other that will provide peace in Europe." If you just say to the Europeans, "Look, we're going away because we're going to fight the Chinese instead, and you're left alone to deal with the Russians," the Europeans are going to freak out because they know they can't take on the Russians, and they know that they're going to lose in Ukraine without the United States. And they also know, the political class in Europe, that their entire future now depends on the United States also. And if the United States gradually withdraws from the scene, especially if Russian influence in Europe starts to grow, that their own positions would be in extreme jeopardy. So what they would do in that kind of situation is that they would try to escalate the war in Ukraine. They would launch missile strikes against Russian territory. They'd start sending European troops to Ukraine. And they're not going to do that because they think that they can defeat the Russians by themselves. They're going to do that because they hope to put the United States in a position where it is dragged back to Europe in order to rescue them. And you can see the rhetoric that's coming out from Europe is exactly that. The Baltic states, who are very vulnerable, already talking about sending their soldiers to Europe. Macron, again, talking this time, he's now talking about causing missile strikes against positions in Europe. That sort of thing. So if the United States does what Mr. Colby says, the situation in Europe will not be minded for him by the Europeans. The situation in Europe will get out of control, and the United States could find itself facing a very difficult choice. Does it get sucked back in, risking a confrontation with the Russians, which is who are a nuclear power, or does it simply write Europe off, which no American official is prepared to do?
Yeah, and we haven't talked about the Middle East. the U.S. will be all the place, everywhere.
Yeah.
That okay. Before we go there, I
Well,
also
before we proceed, there's a very
yeah.
famous quote from a very famous European leader, statesman, who is Frederick the Great of Prussia, who was not only a tremendous political leader, he was a political genius, but he was also a great military leader as well. And he once said, "He who defends everything defends nothing." And that is exactly what the United States is doing, trying to do at the moment.